Uh, Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Hanung. I am an East Asia ASEAN Program Officer of Forum Asia. On behalf of the organizer, I would like to welcome all of the participants to the conference Human Rights in Time of COVID-19, Ways Forward to Addressing the Crisis in Southeast Asia. This 2 days conference is organized by the Asian Forum for Human Rights and Development. So before starting the conference, I would like to encourage all participants to rename yourself in Zoom using your preferred name and organizations that you are represented, if necessary. And feel free to utilize the Zoom chat feature to introduce and meet with each other. However, we encourage all participants here to commit on creating safe space for everyone to express their opinion and exchanging information. And I would like to remind all of you also that currently these conferences are being live streamed through Forum Asia's Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube platform. Without further ado, to commence the conference, I would like to introduce and give the floor to Mr. Gerald Joseph, Commissioner of the Suhakam, the National Human Rights Institution of Malaysia, who will be our overall facilitator for this 2 days conference, as he will provide information on the objectives and the run-through of agenda for today. Gerald, the floor is yours.
Rachel, thank you Forum Asia for the invitation and for organizing or bringing all of us together. I think our hope was that we would see each other face to face and sit like Hanong and Rachel on a table with a coffee, but we'll just have to have our own coffee in our rooms while being connected with friends across the region. So warm welcome to everyone. This conference is titled Human Rights in the Time of COVID-19, Addressing the Crisis in Southeast Asia. I think all of us are hoping that this will move away. The Olympics closed yesterday and we felt happy there were some moments that there could be a world where we could be connected. So, but reality is in our region, COVID is still impacting us very big. And so this 2 days conference is hoping to bring civil society actors, to bring human rights institution actors, to bring ASEAN sectoral bodies, ASEAN mechanisms and individuals to come together to look at some objectives, is to elaborate on the trend of human rights violation and look at the shrinking civic spaces in Southeast Asia. What has COVID-19 done in our human rights spaces? What are the challenges and how do we move forward beyond 2021? The second one is to build a more effective coordination. And this is, I think, important. I see the presence of representative of AICHA here from the ASEAN sectoral bodies. Good afternoon to His Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, commissioners, chairpersons also present. So I think, and directors and leaders of civil society organizations present. So I think the whole idea of Forum Asia bringing us together is to find ways how we can better coordinate, be supportive of each other and find new measures to take the work forward. One is through ASEAN leaders amongst ourselves, including looking at the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework. Also to look at possible action plans between the different actors mentioned. And I think COVID has proven without this collaboration, it's going to be tough to sail alone. So that's our objective for these 2 days of listening and sharing and talking and inspiring each other to work together. To start us off today, we have an opening and welcome remark by the Executive Director of Forum Asia. We welcome Shamini Darshini to take the floor now. Welcome, Shamini.
Thank you very much, Gerald, and a very warm welcome to all delegates today to our 2-day conference, Human Rights in the Time of COVID-19, Addressing the Crisis in Southeast Asia. Since the pandemic hit the Southeast Asian region in February last year, the impact of COVID-19 has seriously impeded the journey towards the realization of human rights in the region and in a novel way. Among various civil society reports and publications during this time on this issue, Apart from our collective alarm at observing the setting aside of human rights in favor of further repression and restrictions impacting millions of people, Forum Asia's own report, Human Rights in Southeast Asia in Times of a Pandemic, concluded that many ASEAN governments have used militarized approaches to manage a health crisis. The introduction of new and alarming emergency measures and the othering of migrants and refugees and the fueling of xenophobia and hate speech, apart from the increase in reprisals against human rights defenders, have shown the importance of coming together today to discuss how we are to overcome what is a very difficult situation for the region. What is emerging through this crisis is that we need, as Gerald also has mentioned, a coordinated approach among key actors in the region. There is a dire need to build more effective coordination among the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, ASEAN sectoral bodies, national human rights institutions, national, regional, and international non-governmental organizations, think tanks, and civil society at large to build a better, more effective partnership to stem a further deterioration of human rights in Southeast Asia. Over the next 2 days, we will hear from the body of knowledge in attendance, their assessments and suggested responses, national, bilateral, and regional plans that will feed into our collective ways forward to overcome the current challenges. The struggle to achieve social justice and human rights protection must continue. Fostering cross-border solidarity as we build resilience together through fora like this is pertinent as we work to support and empower the vulnerable and the marginalized. Over the next 2 days, we hope to build a deeper understanding of human rights challenges within a current and post-COVID-19 setting to rethink and reboot so we can come back really stronger. As CSOs, NHRIs, ICHA, and ASEAN sectoral bodies discuss the situation in view of developing a joint action plan, we hope to have the commitment of all stakeholders to ensure that our duty to promote and protect human rights, especially at a time when a global pandemic is raging through the region, would be realized. I thank you very much for your attention and wish you a very successful round of discussions in the 2 days ahead. Thank you very much. Back to you, Gerald.
Thank you, Shamini, for those thoughts of capturing where we are. There's always two possibilities. You want to go back to where we were before, but where we were before was not the best too. So there are lessons to rethink and reboot differently. I think it also gives us opportunities on reshaping Southeast Asia as we want it. So with that warm welcome and remarks by Shamini, the Executive Director, we are now ready for the plenary session 1 with excellent speakers on hand. And just as we are about to embark on this first session, to give you a flavor of how these 2 days was envisaged for us to come together as a community of human rights individuals and organizations, is today, this afternoon, is what I would call a listening and inspiring session to capture what's happening on the ground. So it's going to be analysis, there's going to be thoughts, there's going to be proposals. So it's a lot of listening happening today. The first plenary is listening from civil society and ASEAN sectoral bodies from the region. So this is a regional flavor. We've got 5 speakers here, and then we'll have a short break. And then the session 2, we're going to get inputs and from civil society and from the human rights institution and mechanisms, national human rights mechanisms in the region. Not everyone is there, but I think we'll get a flavor, and then we are hoping every speaker will keep to the allocated time, and that's when the moderators will have to be a little bit maybe ASEAN-like, strict like ASEAN, and say time is up in order to get a little bit more discussion going. And then these 2 sessions will inspire tomorrow's discussion. And this is where I'm going to invite representatives from ICHA, ASEAN sectoral bodies, ACWC, NHRIs who are present now. If you can please keep the time to come back tomorrow afternoon, The time is 2:30 p.m. In Malaysia time. I think it's 1:30 p.m. Bangkok and Jakarta time. For the feedback, so what happened is
3:30 p.m.
my
Timor-Leste.
Yeah, and 3:30 Timor-Leste. Great, yeah. And the plan is in the afternoon, when the conference starts, civil society will be having a strategic finalization of their proposals on how to work collaboratively after listening in to all our presentations today. So the idea is how the CSO work with in the national framework, bilateral framework, in the regional plans, together with ICHA and NHRI. So there's going to be some presentations, short presentations, and then we want NHRI, ACWC, ICHA to give your feedback and reactions and even proposals to sharpen those plans. I think those plans may be the first draft of something better to come in our collaboration. So I again appeal to all commissioners, chairpersons, excellencies from the Aisha reps and senior leaders from ASEAN bodies. Please do join us for this session in the afternoon, the later part of the afternoon, and that will be really good to hear your feedback. Okay, with that rough outline of the program, it is my pleasure now to invite the speakers, and I will introduce the speakers just before they are taking the floor so that we can remember who they are. As you can see the program, we have 5 excellent speakers, 2 from civil society, 1 from the ASEAN body, and 2 from ICHA reps who will speak. So each speaker is given only 7 minutes, and I will remind you at 6 minutes you have your one last minute, and I kindly ask you to please wrap up within the 7 minutes. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to invite Ms. Rachel Arini Judistari. She is the East Asia and ASEAN Program Manager of Forum Asia. She has been with Forum Asia on ASEAN advocacy since 2017. Over to you, Rachel.
Thank you so much, Gerald, for the warm introductions. I would like to request help to showcase my PowerPoint. The PowerPoint, please. Thank you. Okay, so today I will share about the state of human rights in Southeast Asia. So in the beginning of the pandemic, we see how this situation has brought havoc in Southeast Asia. And this health crisis also catalyzes the rise of authoritarianism and repressions against democracy, human rights, and fundamental freedoms in the region. Therefore, earlier last year, together with SAPA and also SHAPE-C, we organize assessment on the perception of how civil society see the effectiveness of ASEAN during the pandemic. And then this is the respondent. And it's overwhelming to see that 75% of respondents disagree that the ASEAN human rights mechanism have ensured the adoptions and implementation of human rights-based approach in the ASEAN pandemic responses. And 81% of respondents also disagree that ASEAN leaders have successfully protected the rights of people during the pandemic. The 5 rights that are perceived to be most deteriorated are freedom of expression, assembly associations, human rights defenders, migrant and refugee rights, as well as the indigenous rights. However, there are some appreciations because there is opportunity to engage with ASEAN officials who are become the champion of these issues, and I think most of those champion are here join us today in this very warm virtual room. And also the non-interference principles of ASEAN has been identified as one of the challenges by the CSOs for ASEAN to have a unified solutions. We also compare ASEAN with other mechanisms. As of the end of 2020, we see that there is a joint statement on COVID-19 being issued by ASEAN compared to 25 issues by the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights. And then we also see the issues that being addressed by different regional mechanisms are very comprehensive because the European Union touch on the issues of LGBTIQ, refugee and asylum seekers, and even the African Union talk about human rights defenders. And in this mechanism, they are creating a guideline toolkit as well as establish task force. This is something that we might want to see as how the mechanism that we have in ASEAN should respond to COVID. However, as the time change, we also continue our documentations. And in the first 6 months of 2021, Forum Asia found that the government passed and implemented repressive policies aimed at weakening civil society and social movement. And furthermore, under the guise of the pandemic response, the prolonged ban for assembly are reinforced by the state-sponsored violence. There are 5 trends that we see happening in our regions. One is on emergency laws that are vaguely defined. Second is on digital authoritarianism, and then overly broad national security laws. We also see how the reprisals against human rights defenders, which include journalists and paralegal, is now on rising. And of course, we need to talk about what happened in Myanmar. So the first trend on the vaguely defined emergency decrees, we see how the unnecessary, ineffective, and disproportionate emergency laws affect protection of fundamental freedoms. Right to protest are being denied, lawyers and paralegal are targeted. We also see how individuals who speak out are being accused of inciting public fears or public chaos. Legislation targeting fake news on the pandemic has been used in some countries in ASEAN, such as Cambodia, Thailand, Malaysia, and Indonesia. We also see that these emergency laws widening social and economic divide, which I'm sure my colleague Ryan will be able to talk more about it. The emergency laws also impacting foundation of our democracy, as we saw what's happening in Malaysia, and how it is impacting the schedule of elections. The restrictions also might affect the upcoming Philippines and Cambodia elections. The second trend that we are seeing is the rise of digital authoritarianism. So the laws and policies institutionalizing online surveillance and control by the states are being mainstream in the regions, especially through the contact tracing applications. We also see how across the regions government create regulations for granting authorities overly broad powers to regulate online content, access user data, and penalize companies that fail to comply. Some of these laws include MR5 in Indonesia, the National Internet Gateway in Cambodia, the proposed cybersecurity bill in Myanmar, and cybernetic bill in Timor-Leste. We also see how internet shutdown are normalized in the context of coup and crisis, and there is growing concern on cross-border surveillance. The next trend is the overly broad national security law and ragging of human rights defenders. We see that the laws on national securities are being wielded to discredit civil society actors and social movement as terrorists or as a threat. So this overly broad terminology under the anti-terrorism law allow the government to determine at its own discretions what activities constitute crimes under the law. And this argument on the national security directly and indirectly added restriction for funding to civil society organizations. We also see culture of fear, reprisals against human rights defenders and journalists happening. In Thailand, for example, pro-democracy activists forced compounded charges, including under royal defamation, so lèse majesté law. And then lastly, I think we need to also talk about the Myanmar attempted coup. In total, since 1st February, the junta has killed over 1,100 civilians. and injured 1,000 more, and detained at least 6,994 politicians, activists, journalists, and others. This also includes the use of rapes and sexual gender-based violence against women human rights defenders. And I will wrap up on this.
Richard, the
Yes.
time is up.
Yes. Okay. And then this junta escalated third wave of COVID-19 and continued to bomb. So this is impacting economic situations in Myanmar, and definitely will have spillover impact to the region. And lastly, I think on the recommendations, meaningful engagement of CSOs from diverse thematic issues and background is very needed. And we need to have a regular annual interface meeting, although it's difficult because of the prolonged restrictions. But hopefully, we also wanting joint actions between NHRI, ICHR, and CSOs to address the impact of COVID-19 and coup in Myanmar, and lastly, to strengthen the protections mandates of ICHR. So I will end there. Sorry about my time, over time, and back to you, Gerald.
Are you able to hear me? Yes. Okay, thank you, Rachel. I think speakers don't have to worry to put everything in because the proposal part is coming tomorrow. So there is still a chance to share that through the discussion and the proposals. But thank you so much, Rachel, for already outlining the seriousness of regression in Southeast Asia. We will continue with our next speaker, who is Ryan Silverio, who is the Regional Coordinator of ASEAN SOGI Caucus, a network of LGBTIQ organizations in Southeast Asia that is based in the Philippines. We welcome Ryan. Over to you.
Thank you, Gerald. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to speak about the impact of COVID-19 pandemic towards LGBTI organizations. I will be needing help with regards to my presentation. So in the interest of the time, firstly, I wish to point out that the COVID-19 pandemic is happening in a backdrop of an ongoing series of human rights violations committed against LGBTI persons. Next slide, please. We are seeing a continuous rise of criminalization against LGBTI persons, efforts to increase penalties and persecution have been recorded in many countries. There are attempts towards legalizing conversion therapies. The discourse against LGBTI persons is creeping into censorship laws that are being enforced. Say, for example, in Malaysia, there's been a policy with regards to censorship of a book on religion and homosexuality. Amidst authoritarianism in Southeast Asia, on a positive note, we are seeing a strong participation of LGBTI activists in pro-democracy struggles, but this have entailed risks with regards arrests, including cases of death of LGBTI activists in the case of Malaysia. The NUG report, the one prepared by the Ministry of Human Rights and Ministry of Women, Youth and Children's Affairs of Myanmar, noted that there have been 12 cases of deaths, 73 cases of arrests, and 28 cases of LGBTI persons who are either in hiding or have fled to non-military junta-controlled areas. This is with regards to the impact of the junta crisis and the COVID crisis in Myanmar. We are also seeing cases of violence against LGBTI persons who have committed violations of quarantine policies, such as in the case of the Philippines. Next slide, please. So amidst this backdrop of serious human rights violations, we are seeing an increased sense of solidarity amongst LGBTI persons. Primary reason is because of the growing discontent towards inaction by formal political institutions in ASEAN and in many governments. That LGBTI persons have taken on their own responsibilities to address the immediate needs of their respective communities. Next slide, please. So the response of ASEAN SOGI Caucus is that we prepared an analysis on the situation of LGBTI organizations and how they have been impacted by the pandemic. we limited this study towards organizations because we recognize the important role of groups with regards provision of support, access to resources, and a general upkeep in terms of community building in the respective communities. LGBTI organizations have been quote unquote considered as the primary care entities of LGBTI individuals who are facing crisis situations. So this study covered 48 organizations across the region through an online survey. We also did interviews with 18 organizations. The countries covered entailed 9 countries in Southeast Asia with the exception of Laos and Brunei Darussalam. So what are the findings of this study? Next slide, please. So these are the themes that were generated from our research. Number one is that the pandemic added another layer to the pre-existing marginalization faced by LGBTI persons. Number two, LGBTI organizations have led humanitarian responses to support their communities and continue to adjust their ways of working. Number three, despite an overstretched response done by many organizations, a lot do not have sufficient resources to meet all the needs. And there's also the recognition of online organizing. However, this is deemed as moderately effective and it reinforces digital divide and exposes activists to security and well-being concerns. So next slide, please. So in terms of overstretched capacity of LGBTI organizations, 60% of the organizations we reached out have shifted their focus to address the impact of the pandemic. Half of the respondents said that more than 50% of their constituents are considered as highly vulnerable. So by highly vulnerable, this would mean LGBTI persons who are elderly, persons with disability, from ethnic minorities, migrant workers, rural poor, urban poor, amongst others. And then 62% of organizations have to redesign their planned activities to attend the pressing needs of their members or constituents. So amongst the ways to redesign their planned activities include shifting towards online work, continued physical activities, but following health protocols. And there's a lot of respondents who noted that they had to postpone or cancel some of their activities. Next slide, please. So it's important to note that in a context of a crisis, organizations had to respond in multiple ways. So we have, based on the research, we have noted the following responses. 59.6% of the respondents indicated that they distributed dignity packages. A lot also organized psychosocial and well-being, online support through fundraising, amongst others. Next slide, please.
Ryan?
Yes?
Can you hear me, Ryan? Ryan, can you hear me?
Yes, Gerald.
Your last minute, please. A reminder. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Gerald. Okay, so back to the presentation, please. So high expectations and no sufficient resources have been faced by LGBTI organizations. There's a problem with regards capacity. 47% of our respondents indicated that they don't have secured financial resources that can last through the crisis itself. And in the interest of the time, if you can zoom towards the last slide. So here are the recommendations which I wish to highlight. Inclusion of LGBTI communities in the pandemic responses, including humanitarian responses. I think I have to highlight here because there seems to be a disconnect between advocacy-related work and humanitarian work, and this is being perpetrated by many of the donor organizations. Many LGBTI organizations have faced difficulties shifting their budgets towards humanitarian responses because of certain restrictions with regards donor impositions. And there's also a growing need towards working around economic, social, and cultural rights that has been expressed by LGBT groups. increasing continuous organizing of digital regional solidarity and learning spaces, but at the same time, we have to be mindful by the digital divide. So I'll be sharing this presentation, and soon the research will be published online and we'll be sharing with all of you. Thank you. Back to you, Gerald.
Thank you, Ryan, I'm sorry I have to play that role. But good for updating us what is quite obvious, the impact on the LGBTIQ community in so many countries as shown in your first slide. It's growing, it's not stopping. And I think usually societies will choose a target to vent their hate, and this is dangerous, and you pointed it very well. So with that, we continue with our next presentation is by Miss Lee. Let me get the name right. Sorry, I must get it right. By Miss Lee T. Nam Huang. She has joined the ASEAN Secretariat as the Assistant Director of Human Rights Division of the ASEAN Secretariat since 2017. So she comes with a lot of experience, and we're really happy to have her here, and we welcome Ms. Lee to do her presentation now. Over to you.
Good afternoon, good morning. Thank you very much, Gerald. I've been asked to give a very brief presentation about the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, and I will try to do so. And if we don't have enough time, I will be happy to answer any questions or maybe discussion later on during the conference. So for the start, I would like to emphasize that actually there's a lot of regional initiatives have been undertaken with regard to how the ASEAN respond to COVID-19 pandemic, not only in terms of response, but also prepare for recovery and a long-term resilience approach for the recovery of the community. So we have a number of initiatives either ongoing or is under the development. We have the COVID ASEAN response. We have the regional resource medical supply for public health emergencies. We also already developed the ASEAN strategic framework for public health emergencies. We in the process to establish ASEAN Center for Public Health Emergencies and Emerging Disease. We have the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework that I will talk more about later. At the same time, we also have developed a regional strategic and action plan for ASEAN vaccine security and self-resilience. And last but not least, we last week have adopted as ASEAN Travel Corridor Arrangement Framework. So a lot of work have been carried out, but we know under the pandemic situation as we are being now, it's never enough. Let me try to highlight, I think, and at the same time to answer some of the questions I was asked to during taking this speaking engagement to highlight what is the consultation process in the development of the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework. Later on, it's about what is the key areas and strategies, and last but not least, how to continue engage and partnership with all stakeholders, including civil society. So in terms of consultation, I think the first ever ASEAN official reaction and statement about the pandemic is back in February 2020. That is the Chair of ASEAN statement on COVID-19. And by April 2020, ASEAN had a special summit on COVID-19. And as outcome of the summit, there's a declaration of the special ASEAN summit on coronavirus disease 2019. And in that declaration, there's one among many other actions referred to the development of a comprehensive recovery framework for ASEAN. So it's very early on, the idea is already put on the table and for ASEAN to think and implementing forward. Then by July, some work is going on, and by July 2020, we have the draft concept note of the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, and there's a multi-sector discussion on the concept note, and by September, we had the concept note endorsed by the ASEAN Coordinating Council meeting number 27. And some of you may know, the ASEAN Coordinating Council is the body who in charge of oversight the implementation of all the initiatives with regard to ASEAN response to the COVID-19 pandemic. And is supported by a working group on public health emergencies. During the September and October 2020, there's a lot of consultation was undertaken. There's a stakeholder consultation with Joint Business Council under the framework of the ASEAN Economic Committee. There's also stakeholder dialogue with external partner. With regard to consultation with civil society organization and other stakeholders, there was a briefing also as a part of the fourth forum of entity associated with ASEAN. It was organized on the 20th of October. Apart from that, there was a lot of consultation internally among the ASEAN sector bodies and entity with regard to the purpose of the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, but at the same time also, there's also consultation about the implementation plan of the framework. When we do internal sector bodies consultation, also with a view that the sector bodies would be the one who is entry point to also have consultation and engagement with other stakeholders or civil society organization and think tank, academic and private sector. So we use the sector body as a bridge for consultation also because of the constraint of time, within just a few months. And you know, by November 2020, as a result of the ASEAN Summit, the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework and its implementation plan together was adopted on 12 November 2020. And it was under to promote a whole community approach in response and also recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. In the implementation plan, there's, if I may, there's a three phase of action in response, program and initiative in response, and also implement the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework. One is the reopening phase, and the second phase is recovery, and then a more long-term or third phase, resilience. And both the document, the ACIF, the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, and its implementation plan was uploaded in the ASEAN website on the same day of the adoption. If you go to ASEAN website and it's a newly revamped, you can find the document. It's very comprehensive, so allow me to just to highlight a few key information here. So the framework have 5 broad strategies. One is about enhancing health system. The second one is about strengthening human security. The third one is about maximizing the potential of intra-ASEAN market and broader economic integration. The fourth one is accelerating inclusive digital transformation, and the fifth one is advancing toward a more sustainable and resilient future. With regard to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights that that our representative will speak later on, the initiative that AICHA have embedded in the implementation plan of the ACIF is under the strategy number 2 and the strategy number 5.
Ms. Le, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, I think your time is coming up. If you can wrap up, please. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I will share my slides, so you can read in detail, but just to highlight that the ACIF initiative was embedded with human rights principle and value, and it's very much take up what was recommended by AICHA in the press release on COVID-19. So it's about human rights inclusion, non-discrimination, the participation and inclusion is the key guiding principle there, and it is complementary to the ASEAN whole community approach in COVID-19 pandemic response and recovery. There's a number of activities embedded in the ICHA by ICHA in the implementation plan. It is actually very much about public to human rights and SDG. Beyond that, because I know our representative from ICHA would highlight more on what ICHA been doing in relation to the ACIF. I just want to highlight that apart from ICHA, the other ASEAN human rights mechanism in also in ASEAN also contribute and part of the implementation plan. So if you look into the implementation plan, you would see the commission, the ASEAN Commission for Protection and Promotion of the Rights of Women and Children. We also see initiative by the committee, ASEAN Committee, to implement the convention, ASEAN Convention on Protection and Promotion of the Rights of Migrant Workers. Maybe just a few seconds, just to say, we've been monitoring the implementation of the ACIF and implementation plan, and good news is we have set up recently a unit focused and dedicated on support as what we call is ACIF support unit for the implementation and monitoring of the comprehensive framework. We heard the news from the unit that majority of the initiative that planned for 2021 be carrying out, and there's some kind of report hopefully coming up in a few weeks and months by the end of the year. Just last comment about stakeholder engagement and partnership. I think we really highly value what we call the whole community approach, and we believe that the quality of engagement and partnership with the stakeholder, all the stakeholders in ASEAN, is the key to ensure the success of that approach and to ensure that we can recover better. And so that definitely is the underlying, principle here. There's maybe in the process of the conference, I would be very happy to engage in more like, okay, what exactly the kind of activity that we can do together. Allow me to stop here, and thank you very much.
Thank you, Ms. Le. Sorry for the time, shortness of time, but if you can share this important points for us, it's very, very good information. I don't think many of us are aware. And also that there is a unit, a support unit now for ACHR, and there's a whole society approach, which means you don't pick and choose on human rights. It's a more holistic framework. I think that's a good way to move forward. But I think, thank you so much, Ms. Le, because moving on from you, we have two other colleagues who would then probably add on to what you've already outlined. We have now with us Her Excellency Yuyun Wahyu Ningrum. Many of us know her for many years in the human rights field. She's the Indonesian representative to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights from 2019 to 2021. So it's our pleasure to invite her. And Yuyun, you have the space. And similar, I will try my best to remind you at 6 minutes. I don't know whether you hear me or not, but I will be waving frantically to help you just know the time. Thank you so much. Over to you, Yuyun.
Thank you, Gerald. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Nam Hung. Your presentation helped me a lot. I would like to share my screen. Okay, this one. Just a continuation of what Nam Hung earlier mentioned. The question given to me is about ICHA response in relation to pandemic and alignment to the 5 years priority work plan and keep forward after engaging with ICHA, civil society, and national human institutions. So to add what Nam Hung already mentioned, ICHA response to pandemic is through at least 6 areas. Common approach, we come up with the press statement on the 1st May 2020 as the implementation of Article 4.11 in our TOR, and then through program. So more and more now, when we organize activities, we include some sessions in relation to COVID-19 or to include some guided questions in relation to the session or the topic discussed in the session. In our regular discussion in iChair meeting, we also come across to a number of issues in relation to COVID-19. And as mentioned earlier, in SCRF, we also include human rights into the implementation part. And also we call for human rights centered responses for recovery phases. Also cooperation, I will go later, but I don't mind to tell now because the priority program for 2022 already approved by foreign ministers last week. So we are going to have a consultation on human rights and public health emergencies as with SANEF. This is SANEF come to our meeting last year, and we discussed about possible cooperation, and the thing that continued to be mentioned by both iChair and SANEF members were about pandemic and how human rights protection post-pandemic. So that kind of discussion has been included in our priority program 2022. And individual country representative of iChair also had organized or involved in number of conversation and programs in relation to COVID-19. Myself organized a referral system in relation to COVID-19, as well as on right to remedy and right of person with disabilities during pandemic in the webinar version. So these are some of the activities that Namhang earlier. I just put into because the organizer asked me to link to the 5-year work plan. Usually, most of the activities we propose to the SCRF link to the focus area on strategies for cooperation to promote and protect human rights, because the enabling factors in the SCRF is about policies post COVID-19 on during recovery. So that is why we include this activity. We took some of the activities under priority focus area 2 into the SCRF. So by implementing a 5-year work plan, we also implement the SCRF and vice versa. So for the consultation on human rights and public emergency, Indonesia will take a lead, and it is going to be done in 2022. As I mentioned earlier, the priority program already approved by the foreign ministers last week. We also include ASEAN Forum on SDG 11 because the role of cities becoming more and more important in addressing COVID-19. It is in the 5-year work plan, and it is going to be implemented this year, and Indonesia will take a lead on this program. Consultation on human rights and impact on industry. This is related to the freedom of expression and digital rights. It is also included in 5-year work plan, it focus area 2. Perhaps this is something that Vietnam will take lead on this, and consultation on ensuring the adaptable and education for vulnerable and marginalized group. This is also in 5-year work plan, focus area 2. Cambodia may be taking this activity forward. Number 5 on nexus on public health crisis and mixed migration. This is the area in which we can talk about migrant workers, refugees, asylum seekers in relation to COVID-19. It is in the 5-year work plan 2021-2025, focus area 2, and will be implemented by Indonesia 2022, already approved by the foreign ministers. And the last one is the initiative to share best practices in the context of public health emergencies. So in both in 5-year work plan and also in SCRF, we put some activities that very rigid. It means it's very very detailed, but at the same time we also put activities that open for possibilities, because the length of the 5-year work plan is until 2025, and we are no longer in the iChair. So we would like to provide a space in which the new representative will be able to respond the current contemporary issues after 2021 by having this kind of a flexible element both in a 5-year work plan as well as in SCRF. And the other one is on enabling sustainable economic growth. Yes.
Just a reminder, 1 minute more.
Yeah. So this is about the business and human rights included in 5-year work plan, already implemented by Thailand in 2020, in December 2020, if I'm not mistaken. And then training program in mainstreaming human rights implementation of SDGs, because we also recognize that the achievement of SDGs during COVID-19 becoming lag behind. So we put some possible platform for member states and ICHR to discuss further on how to move forward with SDGs during and post pandemic. Key forward, we would like to implement what we have intended to do based on 5-year work plan as well as the SCRF. These are some intended outputs that we listed here. Most of them are about contributing to the policies. One of the ICHR mandate is to provide the policy support, technical assistance to ASEAN member state and ASEAN sectoral bodies. So these are some of the contribution of how ICHR engage with sectoral bodies and ASEAN member states. And yeah, maybe just one thing that I would like to highlight here, in the implementation of these all activities, of course, we are going to have participation from civil society. The thing that we mentioned very specifically on SANEF, because we would like to the next representative to recognize that that particular activity was discussed during ICHR SANEF meeting, and this was supposed to be the concept not should be discussed both by ICHR and SANEF at the same time and get consensus by both, because this is something that we would like to work together between the national human institutions and ICHR. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yuyun, for carrying forward from what was mentioned earlier by Ms. Le. And I think one of the strengths is a lot of engagement and consultation to capture what's on the ground and to give proposal. I think that's what you've proven. And also looking at different strategies of, you said the cities base, COVID has opened up a different way of understanding governance, governments, and also responses. So I think that's a new area. And also you mentioned of the 5-year work plan that is in place. And also the CNF ICHR, the Southeast Asian National Human Rights Institution Forum. In Southeast Asia, there are 11 countries. And in that 11 countries, only 6 have a human rights institution. So 5 still don't have. That could be a common project for us. One day, every country will have a human rights institution. But that partnership, I think, thanks to ICHR reps, they've done a great job in opening up the spaces. So from Indonesia, thank you, Ms. Yuyun. We move on to His Excellency Eric Paulson, the Malaysian representative to the ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, also from the period of 2019 to 2021. And it's our pleasure now to invite Mr. Eric Paulson to take the floor. Over to you, Eric.
Thank you, Gerald, for the very kind introduction. And thank you, Forum Asia, for the invitation. I fully adopt the previous presentation presented by Nam Hong and also Yuyun, both are my colleagues at the ICHR. I've been asked to present the situation of human rights in Southeast Asia, mainly affecting the situation of migrants and refugees. Measures have been taken by countries all over the world to limit the spread of COVID-19 with varying degrees of interference and impact upon human rights. Regardless of the approach to containing the virus and protecting public health, simultaneous steps should be taken to respect human dignity and rights. The right to life and health are universally recognized and are a fundamental part of our understanding of a right of a life with dignity. Other rights are also engaged by the authorities' reaction to the disease outbreak as we face lockdowns and other restrictions. While human rights must not be compromised lightly, there can be competing factors at play and they must be balanced. The freedoms of personal liberty, assembly, association, movement, religion must be weighed against the right to life and health in a way that is justifiable and in line with international standards. Any limitations on our rights must be necessary, proportionate, and in the pursuit of legitimate aim. While protecting public health must be prioritized, we should not abandon our principles and commitments to other rights, including equality and non-discrimination. Unfortunately, there have been a worldwide report of a rise of racism and xenophobia as a result of the spread of the disease, fueled in part by hate speech and disinformation online. As a region that is proudly multicultural, multiracial, and multi-religious, we must not fall into this trap of looking for others to blame. We should look for solidarity, not scapegoats. When we think about public health, we sometimes forget that the public are not one homogeneous group. Our population includes people who are elderly, suffering with disabilities, in poor health, low-income earners, indigenous, stateless, refugees, migrants, including many who are undocumented and everything in between. Measures taken to control the spread of the disease will necessarily impact upon people of all backgrounds, some more than others. The effectiveness of the response on those who are the most marginalized will have a direct impact on society. Consider the struggles of refugees and migrants in the region who are often tolerated or welcome on an informal level, but are not legally recognized unless they arrive in accordance with national laws or if they are regularized later. With limited access to lawful employment, state education, or reliable information in their own language, refugees and migrants are already more socially and economically vulnerable. Crucially, they have limited access to healthcare. Most have legitimate fears of arrest, detention, and deportation because of their legal status, and avoid healthcare and other public services altogether. The lack of recognition and truly accessible healthcare for refugees and migrants therefore creates a risk for everyone. This simply cannot go on when we are facing a global pandemic which does not operate on the basis of one's legal status. Fortunately, there's a growing recognition that this disease does not discriminate and the COVID-19 vaccines are gradually being made available to refugees and migrants. Southeast Asia stands at the crossroads of mixed migration movements. There are refugees fleeing from conflict or persecution seeking asylum in neighboring countries, while many others are migrants leaving their home countries in search of better economic opportunities. There are a wide variety of overlapping push and pull factors that cause people to move irregularly, often putting themselves through dangerous journeys. While governments have a duty to protect their borders and respond to security concerns, the enforcement of stricter border controls can heighten the vulnerabilities of refugees and migrants who move irregularly. They may take more risks to circumvent immigration authorities, often resorting to smuggling networks, or they may even fall into the hands of human traffickers, as exemplified by the discovery of mass graves on both sides of the Thai and Malaysian borders in 2015. Myanmar is the biggest source of refugees for neighboring ASEAN countries, especially to Thailand and Malaysia, with the decades of civil war, persecution against the Rohingya and other ethnic minorities, and more recently, the military coup. We have seen refugees and migrants make the dangerous journey from Myanmar and Bangladesh to Southeast Asia. The humanitarian consequences are considerable. As people traveling through unsafe land routes and across the seas in search of safe haven or for a better life, accidents are frequent, and many disappear at sea or simply push back. They face hardship both in countries they transit through and once they reach their final destination. It is important that we keep a spotlight on this dangerous migration as it can save lives. The 2015 crisis led to the special meetings on irregular migration in the Indian Ocean organized by the Thai government, which led to important discussions, although what were agreed and acted upon were limited. As for economic migrants, if they are irregular or becomes irregular, they are also in a difficult situation, as without legal status, they will be subjected to the host country's immigration laws, which can involve arrests and long periods of detention until eventual deportation. However, ASEAN does recognize the need to protect migrant rights and has pursued various regional measures to combat exploitation, including adopting the landmark 2007 ASEAN Declaration on the Protection and promotion on the rights of migrant workers, and subsequently the 2017 ASEAN Consensus. Although ASEAN is keen to promote safe migration, i.e. that migration should be regular, but in reality this may not be possible as refugees flee to war or persecution, and oftentimes irregular migration is the only option. As for economic migrants, there are circumstances that compel them to choose irregular migration as an option, either through a lack of regular migration opportunities or a cost-benefit analysis that regular migration also does not guarantee legal status or a stable or as promised employment, meaning if you're going to get exploited anyway, why pay more? ASEAN's general policy response to irregular migration is mostly from a perspective of security and sought to address it by tackling smuggling of migrants and trafficking persons and other transnational crimes. However, it is essential that the measures adopted by states to manage migration...
Eric, reminder of your time, Eric, 1 minute.
Integrate some essential humanitarian consideration and adherence to international laws and norms. For instance, without proper screening mechanism, how can we be sure that those who are vulnerable or at risk, such as refugees or trafficked people, are protected and not put in harm's way? What happens next when more boats arrive carrying desperate refugees to the shores of Thailand, Malaysia, Indonesia? Or, as we are seeing now, refugees fleeing to the Thai border. The laws and policies concerning refugees in these ASEAN member states most affected are not uniform or consistent, and much also depends on the prevailing national political climate and the situation of COVID-19, which will decide how these refugees will be treated. ASEAN should respond more urgently with coordinated policies, both for refugees fleeing persecution or conflict and economic migrants looking for better opportunities. While each member state will rightly have its own laws and policies, common rules should be developed to give refugees and migrants more protection and dignity. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Eric Paulson, for highlighting the test between balancing rights. I think that's the difficulty. Any government does not want to be in this position now because the demand for right to health must be balanced with other rights. You cannot say, okay, now stop those rights. So what is the proportional necessary? If there are any restrictions, it must be proportionate and necessary and using the rule of law, not rule by law. But also recognizing there are so many vulnerable groups. I think he's listed them out, and COVID has made it even more difficult, but also showing that ASEAN needs to do more for more comprehensive framework on economic migrants as well as asylum seekers in the region. It's tough. What do you do? Every country is sovereign. They have their own laws. But as a region, how do we manage? And I think we know the Rohingya movement of people have been happening for decades, and now even more with the Myanmar coup, more refugees are not going back or coming out, not only Rohingya. So there are questions that need to be addressed, and I think we'll have to pick it up. Thank you so much, Mr. Eric Paulson. Friends, we've got excellent 5 presentations. We only have a very short 10 minutes. So if you have any questions or comments, please type it in the chat box. So then I will just address it to the panel speakers who then have 2 minutes as their closing statement in picking up the question, if you have anything. But I'm giving a bit of time, but I think to the panel members, I think in your winding up, listening to each other's comments, one question strikes out. How do we move from engagement, consultation, to actually transforming action that is meaningful to affected communities on the ground? So, civil society works at different areas on the ground, and they actually want ASEAN to work. I think all of us are here because we want ASEAN to be more and to do more. So maybe as you all pick those points up, you can also say, where's the ASEAN interface with this, and how does it, what are the spark points to take it to the next level? Maybe COVID has presented a better opportunity because all 10 countries are suffering from COVID. I mean, there's no big country, small country, rich country, everyone, we are all suffering together. So how can we manage? So I think that's something I'm just throwing for your own consideration. But I hear some, I think there was a mention about even equity and equality to vaccination, which is a big demand now amongst country and even within the country. So I think there is a comment made about the issue of government corruption on COVID management. Maybe corruption could be something if you want to touch on, whether COVID-19 has brought better spotlight and focus on governance, or has it made it worse, and what perhaps could move forward. I think while I'm waiting, I think these are probably some things that I see from the rest have asked for your PowerPoints and your presentations. But I think with that, maybe we'll come to the end part, and I will give each speaker, if you can just give your final closing statement, 1 minute, 1.5 minutes, on what you think how do we pick up some of these broader ideas into more succinct ways of implementation. Okay, I think there's also points about the pandemic. We have seen additional powers given to security forces, including policy and military, and abuses have been documented. How is ASEAN ensuring that their policies also address this issue? So this is how in-country and the ASEAN framework have a chance to speak to in-country processes, okay? The other one is a general comment that ASEAN countries should support each other. So with those thoughts, thank you, friends, for making your comments online. I will now open up the floor back to our speakers. Maybe we can go back in reverse since we started the other way around for your final statement. We'll start with His Excellency Eric for your 1 minute closing statement.
Thank you very much, Gerald. I think when it comes to engagement with ASEAN, I think we all recognize that various ASEAN member states have got different levels of engagement with civil society, and I think that is reflected in terms of how the system of governance, the way that how ASEAN works, as we all know, is all 10 countries must agree by consensus. It's also a strength and also is a weakness of the ASEAN decision-making modality. Here, I would urge that I know this has been said at various forums. We must engage other representatives and other countries so that we can more or less be in sync. Because how ASEAN works is really by peer pressure. If the majority of countries wants to do something, then the other countries which might not be so keen, I think they would go along with it. So currently, when it comes to ASEAN member states or representatives that are really pushing the boundaries of what can be done within ASEAN, I think it's still low, on the low side. Let's work on getting other ASEAN member states to join such discussions. Thank you.
Thank you, His Excellency Eric Paulson. We now continue with Her Excellency Yu Yun to make a final statement.
It's too early to make a final statement, but anyway, for engagement, I think what we are trying to do is beyond meeting and engaging. Gradually, ICHR has shown that when the meeting happened, when the engagement actually happening, please come up with some ideas, and then ICHR will be able to move forward. What we have done with SENA, for instance, this is an example of how our discussion can be transformed into joint program. This is not the first time. We also did this a joint activity together with CPR. Well, in CPR rather difficult, but anyway, this is something that we try very hard to move away from beyond the meeting or engagement, and coming up with the cooperation which put the two parties in equal manner.
Thank you, Yu Yun. We now invite Ms. Lei T. Nam Hong to make her final closing statement for this session.
Thank you again for having me. Yeah, if I may, I think we believe that stakeholder engagement and partnership is crucial for implementing the ASEAN comprehensive framework, but also, as well as other initiatives in relation to human rights. And from what I see, I think there's a need to be better connected at the regional level and also at the national level. And as you are from the national human rights, one of the national human rights institution in ASEAN, I think that is somewhat the kind of link that we need to strengthen and enhance. The question here is now how those member states who haven't set up the national human rights institution, then what would be the focal point and how to connect between regional and national level? I think that's a question for us to address, maybe through the more active role of the representative, or maybe other channel, because IHR is the one, but as just to remind you, I mean, we have also other human rights mechanisms in ASEAN. So maybe through those mechanisms, we can also have a better link and interconnected in many ways. I believe that there's many things we can do more, but at the same time, we need a better understanding. We need more dialogue like this, so we can have a better understanding, then we can move forward. And last but not least, I think we need to look all the time, remind us that respect human rights in the time of crisis like this is very important to build a more effective and inclusive solution for the emergency of today, but also for recovery of tomorrow. And let's work together on that direction. And thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Le. I think you have spelled out the gaps, and we need to work together. Where there's NHRIs, let's move on. Where there's none, let's continue working and finding connecting points. I think that's a very good way to move forward. I'm glad that the ASEAN Secretary is actually a good partner on this front. Thank you so much. We invite now Ryan Silverio for your final last minute to close this session. Thank you, Ryan.
Thanks, Gerald. The principle of solidarity has been articulated many times, and it has been internalized by LGBTI organizations. It has pushed many groups to go beyond traditional ways of working, transcending borders to find alternative solutions to combat the crisis. The principle of solidarity is something that we also wish to put forward to ASEAN. We recognize the engagement is very important, but ASEAN should also recognize that there is power relations happening. We cannot continue engaging at the same time when ASEAN has structural limitations in addressing sensitive issues. I think being in a position of power, ASEAN should also not talk about engagement alone, but also really open its doors to have meaningful collaboration with marginalized groups. Thanks.
Thank you, Ryan. I think, colleagues, you can also keep reading the comments in the chat box. There's a reminder that the violence against women is another serious issue that has increased during this pandemic period. And I think there's some reports people are sharing. So let's use that as an active way to interlink. Thank you, Ryan, for that reminder of what solidarity means and how it must be meaningful. Thank you. And now we invite Rachel Arini to give her final closing statement for this session. Rachel?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Gerald, and also all the panelists who have provided insight on this. I think I would like to build on what Nam Hong has highlighted to us, that we are currently in an extraordinary situation, so sense of urgency need to be implemented when we are dealing with the situations, and therefore it's important to ensure that civil society organizations are also monitoring the implementation of the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework, and also to ensure that human rights principles is prioritized within the framework. Alongside that, as has been mentioned by all of the panelists, we are currently facing a test with the military attempted coup of Myanmar. This is going to have a huge spillover impact in our region, and therefore collaborations between ICHR, NHRI, the CSOs are very important in addressing this. So hopefully we can use our time today and tomorrow to also discuss how we can work together better in addressing the situation. And lastly, I want to also remind everyone that actually since last year, the panel of experts has been created to review the term of reference of ICHR. Therefore, it is important for us to keep accelerating the political will for the ASEAN member states to finalize the process, because we need to have a forceful and strong mechanism in our regions to address the impact of pandemic to human rights. Thank you so much, Gerald.
Thank you, Rachel. A big hand, a virtual hand for all our panel members for your thoughts. And I think it is an extraordinary period, extended extraordinary period of the pandemic impacting all of us. We just thought the last time it will not be so serious, but it's now stretched on. And there's urgent need for us to respond. Governments are struggling. It's not an easy period. Civil society wants that not to be used as an excuse to forget human rights, because the convenient way is to say, okay, I've got public health crisis, so take a break, human rights. But you can't. Human beings remain human beings with dignity. And that's why I think the reminder of so many issues on the ground cannot be forgotten by every state in ASEAN or in Southeast Asia. So thank you so much for that inspiring insight and honest evaluation on the ground, and also hopeful points on how to work together and move forward. So a big thank you to the panelists. With that, we come to the end of this session. I think we are going to now take a 10-minute break. And please don't go anywhere, have a coffee and break, rest time. But we have a continuing session with some panelists from the NHRI and CSOs who will also share their thoughts on this crisis impacting human rights in the region. Thank you so much.
Okay, good afternoon, participants and distinguished speakers. Welcome back to the conference Human Rights in the Time of COVID-19. I hope you have managed to take coffee, have a little break, stretch your arms, so that we are going back again to have more discussions on today's topic. So from the first session, we have learned on the regional landscape of how the COVID-19 have affecting human rights in the region, and followed by responses from the ASEAN bodies and its human rights mechanisms. So moving on to the session 2, titled Navigating Human Rights in Times of Pandemic, Assessment from Civil Society and Response from the National Human Rights Mechanism. We will be hearing more local context in the impact of COVID-19 to human rights and democracies on countries in Southeast Asia. Allow me to introduce myself first. My name is Hanung from Forum Asia, who will be the moderator for these sessions. And today with us, we are joined by our distinguished speakers. Allow me to introduce themselves. The first one is Ms. Fatia Maulidianti. She's the coordinator of the Commission for the Disappeared and Victim of Violence, Contrast, from Indonesia. And then we also have Mr. Ryan Chua, the program director of Pusat Komas, an organization that has been actively promoting equality and the elimination of all forms of racial discrimination in Malaysia. Both of the speakers will give the presentation from the civil society perspective on the overall situation of COVID-19 and how it has impacting human rights, civic space, and their works in their respective countries. Then we will hear also presentation and responses from the distinguished representatives of National Human Rights Institution presented today. Please allow me to welcome Mr. Gerald Joseph, the Commissioner of Suhakam, Malaysia. And then Mr. Ahmad Taufan Damanik, Chair and Commissioner of Komnas HAM, Indonesia. And last but not least, Ms. Andi Yendriani, the Chair and Commissioner of the National Commission on Violence Against Women, or Komnas Perempuan Indonesia. So each speakers for this session will be given 10 minutes. And I will be the bad person here, and will give you a reminder 1 minute before the time is ended. And I would like to apologize in advance for the inconvenience that might occur. So without further ado, I would like to give the space and time for Fatia for her presentations. Fatia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Hanung, for the time and the opportunity to also share the situation on the situation of COVID-19 and how it's actually affected to the situation of democracy and human rights in Indonesia. And allow me to also say hi to the other participants here, and then also the other speakers, distinguished speakers here. And it was a very long time since we've been met, so let me just start my presentation. And so we can continue. Okay, so this is actually one of the presentation that I already shared with the other fellow CSOs in Asia during other events, that we think that this is very relevant with the situation right now when we are facing the civic thinking space and how the democracy is at stake because of the situation of COVID-19, and facing how the government actually doing a lot of repressive acts in the middle of the pandemic situation. Okay, next. Okay. Yeah. So basically, at the critical moments before the early detection of COVID-19 in Indonesia, the public was faced with discouraging statements aimed at avoiding public panic that could potentially disrupt the wheels of economy, but instead had an impact on the community awareness that impacting on the transmission to date. Then a lot of people actually getting infected with COVID-19 because the public officials itself, like ministers and then also president itself, they are also being denial with how the COVID-19 is very dangerous for the situation in Indonesia at the beginning when COVID-19 just entered. And as a reminder that the statement in question include the statement by the Minister of Health that's saying the COVID-19 cannot enter Indonesia because of the prayer and it can heal itself. So 72 billion incentive for influencers to promote tourism by Luhut Binsar Panjaitan, and then also Mahfud MD jokes about the coronavirus like a wife to make necklaces, and the coronavirus by Ministry of Agriculture, apart from the policies that are indeed dangerous, such as influencer services to promote the tourism in Indonesia in the middle of COVID-19 spreading. So the government in the middle of pandemic actually busy with other work, such as the formulation, the discussion of ratification of some problematic laws, and they're creating some kind of, like a loophole for them to actually enact several problematic laws, such as the job creation law or omnibus law, the mining law, and then also the implementation of local election, while in fact it is counterproductive with the pandemic handling policy made by the government themselves, with many health protocol violations that have occurred throughout this implementation during the local election. And the authorities does not really strictly enforce health protocols on the local election participants and their supporters. And on the other hand, we actually note that there are the conditions of the COVID-19 pandemic are actually used as a justification for committing two forms of violations of civil liberties, namely suppressing freedom of expression and imposing inhuman penalties. With regards in the eradicating freedom of expression, we find that the COVID-19 is one of the most sensitive issues in the context of violations of the freedom of expression, when a lot of CSO groups and then also the civil society, students, laborers, and other groups that actually demanding the government to actually do some strict or very questioning how the government actually react and then enacting problematic laws without any public participation. So we have paid several attention to this phenomenon since April 2020, when the national police also enacting or creating several circulating letters, such as telegram letter. At least there were 5 telegram letters that actually against with the civic freedom in Indonesia. One of them is letter on containing the crime in cyberspace, like the emphasizing regarding the law enforcement incident or insulting the authority or president and the government official during the pandemic situation. And moreover, there are several instructions from the national police to carry out cyber patrols to monitor news and opinions that have potential to spread hoaxes. And it's actually creating like 938 cases of civil liberties violations that actually, used with the telegram letter that's saying the people are doing insults or like a contempt to the president or even spreading hoaxes. And the government also regulate people's behavior during the COVID-19, which actually creating several violations, such as arbitrary arrest. And this is not in line with democracy, which requires that general public being given the widest possible stage to convey corrections to the actions of the government, and a lot of mass action actually being suppressed by the police apparatus itself. Okay, next. So this is like the violence trend that been happening during the pandemic situation, such as the arbitrary arrests and then cyber torture, which creates from the cyber patrol regulation, and then also extrajudicial killing, that which happening a lot to the Papuan people that actually raising their voices related to the human rights situation in Papua, and the racial discrimination, and also restriction for any kind of discussion that's criticizing about how the president administration right now, the current regime, is actually conduct the COVID-19 handling that is not really effective, and questioning about his leadership through the situation of pandemic, and then also how the democracy is actually regressing. Next. Yeah, and this is the research from the Civicus Alliance that we know the democracy situation and civil liberties in Indonesia is in the life rating of obstructed, which we know that from the economic index unit also saying that Indonesia is lowering its position to 2 points since 2019. So the democracy is being regressed. Next. And this is one of the data that actually emphasizing all of those facts that we are facing the civic shrinking space, which there are a lot of arbitrary arrests, and then stigmatization, intimidation, and then cyber torture that happening in the digital sphere that faced by the human rights defenders. For example, like in the last 2 weeks, we already received 3 cases of human rights defenders at risk when they are being threatened by the public officials, such as the chief or the chair of the presidential staff office, Muldoko, that threatening one of the anti-corruption activists from Indonesian Corruption Watch because they are criticizing about the involvement of public officials in medicine business in Indonesia during the COVID-19 situation. And the next one is one of the director of Bali Legal Aid, that being criminalized because of defending the Papuan people that raising a mass action in Bali. And the other one is Effendi Buhing, which is the leader of Kinipan, indigenous people in Kalimantan, that also being criminalized by the government because of their defending the land of the Kinipan indigenous people group. And next. Yeah, so the key problem is that, wait a second. So the key problem is that there are a lot of lack of supervisory and evaluation mechanism, which we know that during the pandemic, the government is not really doing scientific and medical approaches to the response on the situation of COVID-19 in Indonesia. They instead choosing securitization since the beginning. So the involvement of the national intelligence, police, and then also the national military are very wide, and how they are actually arresting people and then restricting all kinds of assembly and association for public and all of the people that actually want to criticizing about the situation of large-scale social restriction and other problematic regulation during the pandemic in Indonesia.
Fatia,
Sorry?
you have 1 more minute. So
Okay.
if you can wrap up. Thank you.
Sure. So yeah, I mean, as you may see in my presentation, that the wide authority, lack of supervision and evaluation, and then the impunity situation is actually creating the key problems on how the government using more repressive acts such as securitization during the pandemic. And we know after almost 2 years, we are not getting any better in Indonesia. Better condition, better situation, and civil liberties are getting repressed in the future. And then we see that the democracy situation is not really in a very good position. So I think we have also similarities with the other countries in Southeast Asia, and we should questioning how the leadership of the president itself in handling the pandemic, and even after we are free from the pandemic situation, we have to questioning and then maybe evaluating how the leadership of the government itself in enforcing the democracy and human rights in Indonesia. So maybe that's all, Hanung. Sorry for a very long presentation. Thank you.
No worries. Thank you very much, Fatia, for giving us the illustration of how COVID-19 has been utilized as a shield by the government to legitimate more repressive laws and practices, creating more restriction for dissenting opinions, fundamental freedoms and civic space, and also hindering the works of the civil society in Indonesia as well. We can get back to you later if there's any question or further comments. But now I'm going to call our next speaker, Mr. Ryan Chua from Pusat Commerce Malaysia, who is giving the presentation for the Malaysian context. Ryan, 10 minutes. The floor is yours.
Hanung, you can hear me, right?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay. All right, great. Hi, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. I'm Ryan from Commerce. So basically, we are just trying to set a little bit context on the current human rights situation in Malaysia with the presence of COVID. And I think my other colleagues later will also be able to explain all of this further. So just to give you a slight background about what is actually happening. So as much as many of us have seen and have known, Malaysia has been one of the beacon of hopes in terms of the promotion of human rights after the change of government. But of course, there were a lot of issues that were happening in between. But then this whole reform movement was halted in March 2020 after the change of the government from the Pakatan Harapan coalition and was replaced with the Perikatan National Government that you are all seeing in present. So what has happened now with the new government in Palm and also with the new approaches and with the whole COVID-19 pandemic, the new government has cracked down on critical speech and protests and has taken a hard line on the treatment of refugees and undocumented migrants. So democracy is also under threat with the PN government using COVID-19 to hold on to power. So in essence, when we are looking at the whole situation, I'll just share in terms of the 5 different trends of what are some of the impacts on human rights in Malaysia. This is not an exhaustive list, but these are some of the key themes that were recurring. Firstly, is in terms of democracy is under threat. Refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants were among the biggest targets of these repressive laws and actions by the government. We also have issues with freedom of assembly, association, and expression. Human rights defenders were also being interrogated and arrested, some of them. And we have issues of the rising of racial and religious discrimination. And lastly, women and child rights are also affected in this aspect. So just give you a short overview. Firstly, in terms of democracy in Malaysia, what has happened is that we have seen that there's a proclamation of emergency ordinance with the pretext of wanting to curb the COVID-19 situation. But in actuality, what we are actually seeing and looking is that the emergency ordinance was actually used to maintain power by the current Perikatan National Government. So what they have done with the emergency ordinance is to restrict the operation of the parliament under the pretext of COVID-19 situation. There were some development last 2 weeks where parliament was finally open, but it was only a 5-day sitting and was meant to be a briefing. But when there were some statements which were released by the Yang di-Pertuan Agong or the King of Malaysia, immediately they used COVID-19 outbreak in the parliament and much more to just stop the entire parliamentary proceedings and discussions. So as we can see, how COVID-19 was used as a shield to protect the current government. Parliament was closed for a very long period of time, but the irony is all members of parliament, or a majority of them, are already vaccinated, and they are given double dose. And they were among the first few who were actually being vaccinated in this whole context. And this has rendered laws and policies to be actually drafted without it being debated. So it brings a lot of question in terms of the legitimacy, what are the expenditure and much more. And this has infringed democracy in Malaysia. Just to also touch a few things, we have standard operating procedures, or what we call as SOPs, but then, we have double standard in the implementation of all those SOPs where ministers are allowed to gather in the Prime Minister's house when there's a issue with the power and much more, but then, we have normal, ordinary Malaysians being charged 10,000 ringgit or even higher, or even some of them were reprimanded just because they were violating the SOP. So there's also the double standard in terms of the implementation of standard operating procedures. And this has really caused a big question in terms of democracy, because we can't challenge this in the parliament. It's been shut and much more. So these are some of the issues that are happening at this point of time. With the whole COVID-19 response, we have issues where the government has taken a hard line against refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. As you can see, government's response was harsh on refugees, asylum seekers, and migrant workers. And if you can see the picture on the bottom right, this is actually released by the government. It stated, migrant ethnic Rohingya kedatangan anda tidak diundang. But it's in English, it's saying that for all ethnic Rohingya migrants, your presence here in Malaysia are not welcome at all. And this is by a government machinery, and this is a poster by the government. After it was being criticized by the people, it was immediately removed. But this is something that we have seen that the government has placed a position and a hard stance against the migrant workers, asylums, especially the refugees. So as you can see, immigration rates involving arrests and detentions were conducted in areas with high migrant populations. Allegations of migrant in forced labor and living in cramped housing in Malaysia's rubber glove industry were also being reported. So these are among some of the issues that we are seeing. So in this sense, even children have been detained in shelters and threatened with prosecution. And these are all migrant, asylum seekers and refugee children. And in Sabah, one of the states in Malaysia, it was also stated by one of the Sabah ministers saying that the government will not assist the statelessness at all. So these are concerning human rights violations as pertaining to these three groups of people. In terms of freedom of assembly, association, and expression, authorities open investigation into activists for organizing protests. So we have Lawan protests happening, have Fadia back then in 2020 at the beginning because of the change of government and much more. They had protests, Hartal doctor contract, where doctors coming out to protest against the contract. The contract staffs and much more in relation to Malaysia, and also in terms of protests fighting against the the enhanced movement control order in specific areas. And you can also see that journalists have been investigated for reports on government's COVID-19 management. So we have, Bu Sulin and Tashni Sukumaran were among some of them who were actually called for investigation for certain reports on the government's management of COVID-19. And even for news agencies, they were not spared. 6 Al Jazeera staff members were investigated and their office raided because of their news on the migrants, on how the government managed the raids on migrants. And then 2 Al Jazeera journalists based in Malaysia were also refused to renew visas. So these are some of the issues, and even member of parliaments who were part of marching towards the parliament were also called for investigation. And the irony of all of this is that human rights defenders are also persecuted. So cartoonists who were really vocal against the government's mismanagement were called for investigation on political satire. Activist Heidi Kwa were questioned who were questioning the mistreatment of migrant workers in detention centers. He was charged in court for internet misuse. And then we have protest organizers were arrested under Sedition Act and have their home raided for Lawan protests. And the irony of all of this, you have Suhakam commissioners who was supposed to be the Human Rights Commission, even one of them who is here, maybe he can share with you later, were actually being called for investigation while performing their statutory duties to monitor the protests. So even commissioners are not spared by the current government's actions. And we have even, groups like people like Enaha and Amin Landak who were also part of pointing out against the issue of police misconduct, were actually called for investigation and the office raided for their video on police brutality. So these are among some of the issues that human rights defenders are experiencing. It's already a downsized, a regressing situation in Malaysia. There was also an increase of racial and religious discrimination in Malaysia, where you have more individuals, non-governmental organizations, and certain members of political parties who try to racialize really incidences on baseless racist fear. So, for example, a Food Panda person who was actually, because he has a weird name and much more, which to a certain extent was provocative to a specific group of people. So there were a group of Food Panda riders actually hitting him, but then we have members of the public and even political parties immediately criticizing them and saying that, look, you are attacking the religious institution of Malaysia and much more. But they should have reprimanded the violence attack, and then you need to investigate such incidences. And the irony of all of this is that we have the Minister of Health taking note of a suggestion of groups to allow more medical graduates, especially among the Bumi Putra. So for those who are not really well aware of who are the Bumi Putras, they are the son of soil. They are the Malays and the Sabah and Sarawak natives who were actually given the term of Bumi Putra. So they are given special, the Ministry of Health actually took note and to a certain extent said, we understand, and then we are going to give you that priority in the selection of certain contract officers for the appointment to permanent service. So this was some of the things. And then we have chief ministers making racial remarks, insulting the Indian community based on specific stereotypes and much more. And you also have member of parliaments calling for the closing of the non-halal section in the supermarket. And all of this were happening during the COVID-19 pandemic. And recently we have also seen a rise on the use of racial and religious politics, especially when you can see that the the current government is shaken. So there are groups of people saying that, look, we have raised, we need to remember that we need to protect the sensitivity of the Malay community and much more, as that was used as their basis to protect their current power. So lastly is in regards to women and child rights, domestic violence.
Ryan, you have 1 more minute. Thank you.
Okay, right, yeah, I'm wrapping up anyways. So in terms of women and child rights, domestic violence and sexual abuse has increased. So Women's Aid Organization, who has worked a lot with these issues, have reported a 360% increase in distress calls received between February and April 2020 itself. 4,349 cases of child abuses were reported by the Women, Family and Community Development Ministry in 2020 alone. Children are at the risk of abuse outside of household. There's a rise in reports of child pornography from 18 to 45 cases after the implementation of the Movement Control Order in March 2020. And all this data is only until March 2020. So imagine what has happened because Malaysia has taken a prolonged Movement Control Order for multiple months already. So in a sense, just to wrap things up, Malaysia has once been a beacon of hope for the promotion of human rights in the region, and now it has regressed and reversed. COVID-19 has exacerbated the situation. We have seen and pointed a lot of flaws with regards to the human rights and the way on how the government treat and in terms of the policies and much more. So really, this is a big issue, and we really need to think of a way on how can we actually work together to try to challenge the current narrative. And of course, I get some doodles on my PowerPoint presentation, but I think that's all from me. Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Ryan, for giving such a very comprehensive overview on how the democracy has been infringed by those who are trying to hold the power, utilizing the COVID-19 momentum, and also how it's impacting vulnerable groups such as human rights defenders, women, children, and even artists. And also you highlight also the importance point of the rising of racial discriminations and anti-migrants and anti-refugee politics that is very prominent happening in Malaysia as well at the moment. And then from the presentation of Fatia as well, and with you, we might see some commonalities that COVID-19 bring as a challenges. And I believe it's also same challenges that also happening in other countries in Southeast Asia. Moving forward, now we are going to hearing the presentations and insights from the representative of national human rights institutions. The first one, I would like to call Mr. Gerald Joseph, the commissioner from Suhakam, Malaysia. Mr. Gerald, 10 minutes is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Hanung. Good afternoon, everyone. I think Ryan has done already all the work for me. So it's also work in Human Rights Commission of Malaysia. Good afternoon, fellow panelists, Pak Taufan, chairperson from Komnas HAM, the other commissioner from Komnas Perempuan, civil society leaders, and all commissioners and IHRFs here. The situation in Malaysia, I think, like most countries, is we are stuck. We have a movement control order. The restriction is necessary step because how do you manage public health when it's widespread? So public health concern versus other rights. I think that's been the biggest challenge of the Human Rights Commission in Malaysia and elsewhere. What do we do? How do we find a balancing? So these are just the different names we use in Malaysia. It's continuing now. We're still on lockdown mode. So this is just an example. 2 days ago, that's our numbers now. But numbers, each country is different because of population, testing. But it's still a big worry for Malaysians. Everybody thought it is gone off, but it's as you know, the new Delta variant is come up again. Yeah. The impact on COVID-19 has multiple layers. I think Ryan Chua from Pusat Komas has mentioned almost all of this, and I will skip some of this because I think he's also spoken about it. The Commission takes a big interest on the right to education. No? The school closure opens for a few weeks, closes, open, online learning, you don't have the appropriate technologies. If you are rural areas, the internet is not up to mark. So all that is a big problem. Teachers also not so used to, but now getting much more used to teach online. And so it's tough. It's tough in a smaller and the conducive situation in small homes, in urban poor homes where it's very tight. Many people live. How do you study? How does you work? And few children study. So this has made it difficult. There's a whole question of that is 2 years of one generation losing out on education. Questions that need to be answered, right? The vulnerable community, the homeless, streetless, informal job sector, I think is also having difficulty in terms of food, where to stay. So initially the government put them in temporary homes in the first round of infection, but now they are out, so the question of how to vaccinate everyone is a big question. So there are many initiatives by volunteer groups for food for the homeless people on the streets, yeah. I think this was even spoken about by Eric Paulson and mentioned by Ryan. Migrant workers, I think the hate speech, incitement to hate has increased so much, and this is a picture of a temporary prison setup when they were arresting migrants for no documentation. And I think the question is, the commission has told the government, why is there an urgency to do arrests now? Because they have been here, they'll be here. The urgency is public health, not the arrest for no documentation. So that's and that arrest has caused infection and outbreaks in prisons and immigration detention centers. So my question is the authorities to be blamed for also spreading the infection in overcrowded prisons and immigration detention center? The issue of stateless people, undocumented people is a difficult area because daily wage is how many people survive. And if it's a lockdown, you cannot survive, you cannot get food, then the whole chain of impact affects you and your family. And also the handout, the government has had many programs for money, cash handout, for food basket, but if you're not in the system, then you do not get the handout. And if you don't have a document, you're afraid to meet officials because you're afraid that you could be arrested by officials without conditions. I think this was mentioned even in the chat box about increase in domestic violence. I think there's some example of the hotline. Domestic abuse increased 57%. This was the last year's impact. And also an NGO, Women Aid Organization, they themselves receive a 360% increase in distress call just between the 3 periods. So I think for the first time, people, whole families are locked up, and it's different because before you did not spend so much of time. Now you not only spend time, but you have to spend time in a tight space, and that increases all kinds of difficulties. And violence has increased, and the question is no one should be a victim of violence no matter what situation, but how have the victims survived this? Indigenous people is a big area, but I will always try to impress upon people that their resilience from before to now is still remarkable, because they still have, those who live close to the forest still have some produce, but the inability to be part of the economic trends to sell their products makes it difficult. And now more recently is the fear of getting vaccination, and that has put them as very slow in being vaccinated, and many of them are afraid because of the untrue WhatsApp messages. So it's taking a lot of effort to get them vaccinated. But I think the government has now decided to have to get the single jab vaccination in order to help make it easier. Refugee asylum seekers we spoke about earlier, this is a big tough area because their documents expire, the offices are closed, so automatically they are considered irregular or undocumented, or the common word used by the authorities is illegal. No? And many of them are waiting to be deported, so if you're arrested and then you get prolonged detention because there's no flight, no ships to send you back, so you are unfairly detained for longer periods of time, and this causes the congestion. Congestion means easy spread of COVID. So I think the common logic of the state security apparatus and public health, I think there's an imbalance. It looks like always Home Ministry, National Security has higher weightage. And I've been saying that public health in this period of time, you have the strongest power of law, but governments don't function that way. Some or other home ministry always have more sway than public health, and that's not good, because management of public health must be professionally managed. But I think the language barriers in the initial one was resolved by a lot of support by NGOs, not United Nations, UN, IOM. They did posters in different languages so people will understand what is COVID. Now there's posters like this for vaccination. The good news is the government has opened up vaccination centers now where refugees, asylum seekers, documented, undocumented workers can walk in and get the vaccination free of charge. That's really good news. Urban poor, I think I mentioned earlier in the houses. Freedom of speech, Ryan mentioned the list of people who get arrested, and this is not a good sign because it's not really linked to COVID. I think it's not about COVID. Malaysia politically is unstable, is very fluid, and so because of that, that has not given a strong basis that criticism of any government should be allowed. But the police is now using its powers to get many people in for investigation. This is a picture of people doing protests in the car, and some were even hauled up for even doing something like this, and that should not be the case, right? Yeah. This is detention of people who violated MCO violation. We think this was not necessary. You violate, you get a fine. You should be doing community work. You don't need to be arrested, jailed, and brought to police lockup. All this increases infection possibility. Parliament, as I mentioned, that's where we are fluid. We need Parliament to be strong in this period. It cannot be locked up because of emergency, and that's the sad part. Workers' right, I think this is the biggest question unanswered. I worry after the lockdown is open, many have lost their jobs. Many will have to start from fresh. The smaller players don't have the means. The bigger companies maybe have some savings, a lot more money. But this is going to be a big issue for ASEAN, and I think it's time we start focusing on economic, social, cultural rights. I won't mention right of health, we spoke about it. But I want to talk about the detention facilities that I mentioned earlier. So we got the numbers.
Gerald, you have 1 more minute. Thank you.
Okay. So my final point is that the saddest part is that in every discussion of the government, they keep using essential service, and then we've been trying to push that human rights actors must be an essential service. So you can see the list number 1 to 11. Usually human rights actors, including the Human Rights Commission, is not listed as an essential service for work and movement. So this is where I think governments need to realize that human rights service must be an essential service. But the Commission continued to do our work in visiting communities affected. This was a Rohingya community affected. We visited the prisons. We still tried, despite difficulty. The boat arrival, we did. It's not easy, but now with vaccination, it's going to make it much more easier. We met the Indian High Commission because of migrant workers who are arrested and detained, and the deportation is too slow. There was a death in custody. So we continue our work in the most creative forms and trying to work with, as you know, online. So this is meeting. Doing our investigation with those we want to get in. This is the forensic doctor, and that's how we continue our work no matter what. But it's not easy, and we need to find more creative ways. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerald, for sharing the works of SWACAM in this matter, and perhaps this can also be a good food for thoughts that we are going to be discussing for tomorrow during the discussion with CSOs and the others. So moving on, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Ahmad Taufan Damanik, Chair and Commissioner of Komnas HAM Indonesia, to give his presentations. Pak Taufan, the 10 minutes is yours. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, moderator. I think I have a presentation. Firstly, I would like to say thank you to Forum Asia for this invitation, and also to good afternoon to all participants, speakers from SWACAM, from ICA, and also from NGOs. Firstly, based on the Indonesian national law on human rights, next. Last year, Komnas HAM already submitted 18 recommendations to Indonesian president and also to the government. I mean, to the minister, some minister, and also local government. Mostly, it is about the legality, the governance, about institution of handling COVID-19 in Indonesia, also about budget, about transparency and accountability. And of course, in this submission, we introduced the human rights perspective, and we raised some special issues like reduction of occupancy in prisons, jails, and detention centers, because it's overcrowded in all prisons and jails in Indonesia. And of course, there are special issue on migrant workers or other workers who are returned from abroad because of they lost their job, and some other specific issue, including the issue on community solidarity, because we think that the government only cannot solve the problem without asking people solidarity. And then after more than 1 year, we see that the situation of COVID-19 is getting worse. Indonesia is now #1 on the fatality rate and other positivity rate, including the medical personnel who died during the COVID-19. According to Labor COVID, this civil society coalitions, until 4 August, there are 1,636 medical personnel died during the COVID-19. And of course, this is illustrate the extent of the state's effort to fulfill the right to health and protect the right to life. Now, Java and out of Java, now we have a specific policy. We call it this limitation activities emergency. Yeah? And then, of course, COVID-19. Yeah? Next, COVID-19 impacting social, economic, and civil and political situation in Indonesia. Poverty rate in Indonesia in September 2020 reached 27.55 million people. I think now it's higher than this number, because the situation of COVID is also getting worse. Unemployment rates also reached 9.77 million people, according to the Central Bureau of Statistics of Indonesia in 2020. I think now it also increased. On the situation of civil liberties, I think it's also impacted. The freedom of expression and opinion have suffered a setback. I think Patia already explained more about that. According to our survey last year also, respondents say that they are afraid to criticize the government. They are also afraid to express their opinions. And regarding the data that we compile, they also happen along with the arrest or criminalization of several individuals and human rights defenders who often criticize the government's performance in dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. So there is a problem on social, economic, and social, political, or civil liberties. And we concern also the fulfillment of right to health. I agree, as Fatia said, that since at the beginning, there is a kind of state negligence in carrying out the responsibility in fulfilling the right of health of its citizens. There is kind of a denial on the situation. Now they realize that, but already late. Equitable distribution and access to health facilities, especially between Java and non-Java, or urban and remote area. Jakarta, of course, we have so many access, so many facilities. That's why testing, tracing is higher than comparing to other cities, especially to remote area. Means that Indonesia need to improve vastly the facilities of health and also the budget, and need to be equal between urban and remote area, Java and non-Java island. Then vaccination as part of fulfilling the right to health. There are 4 points that we, as Komnas HAM, as a Human Rights Commission, propose to the government. One is adequate availability, access to the whole community, and the third is about the ethic. And then the last is about good and safe quality, because it's also a national debate among the people, among the intellectual academicians about is it good vaccine or is it health vaccines, something like that. So we need to ensure that we have a good and safe quality of vaccine, transparent and accountable. And the last is humanist and persuasive approach. So we don't agree with the draft of policy where some government would like to use vaccination as a requirement, administrative requirement for many things, including the social safety net. We don't agree with that. We need to have a humanist and persuasive approach. And then social safety net. This is also a problem of Indonesia. There is a big issue last year when one minister of social, arrested by a committee of anti-corruption because of social safety net budget corrupted by him and also his team. So adequate availability, access to the whole community, transparency and accountability of a social safety net, it is also very important. And of course, special scheme for poor people, for migrant workers who are who return from abroad. And the last, then the right to education. Next. It already said by me. Right to education. During the COVID-19 pandemic, of course, hundreds of thousands of schools closed and impacted more than 62.5 million of students from the school and also from the college or university. In Indonesia, distance learning method has become an option for the government to keep fulfilling the right to education of citizens. But of course, there is a problem of uneven facilities between one place to another place. Urban and rural area, for instance, Java or out of Java island, and also have a family with a poor family. So government or local government must continue to ensure that and facilitate so that online methods are optimal and reach all levels of students, considering the many technical, social, and economic barriers. And also the modification of a method. Sometimes you make students get bored. Law enforcement and sanctions. Komnas HAM realizes that in an emergency situation, human rights may be limited for the benefit of people, referring to the Siracusa principles. But the restriction must still be carried out under human rights principles mentioned by Siracusa principles. Strengthening legality is needed to increase public compliance and prevent abuse of power by law enforcement. And of course, we criticize the government because they also involve Indonesian Army, Indonesian Intelligence, BIN, that's Intelligence National Body, in the enforcement of health protocols and the vaccination, because according to Indonesian law on armed forces, it's not allowed. The Office Human Rights Commission of Human Rights guidelines state that the military should not be involved in the oversight function, especially considering that impunity against the military is still strong. Then enforcement of health protocols during the pandemic must use a more human approach. So we always introduce the humanist and educative approach rather than using the social or legal sanctions. Except to corporation who against the regulations.
Really sorry, but you have 1 more minute.
Yeah, Last week, we again submitted our recommendation to the President of Indonesia and also to the some ministry for improving access every person for testing, tracing, and treatment, an equitable, safe, and free vaccine for all, including in remote area, especially in indigenous peoples, a fair and non-discrimination of social safety net. Until now, there is still 37% of total budget of social safety net already spent. You may imagine only less than 40%. So we need acceleration of spending of social safety net budget for all people, especially who are affected by COVID-19 pandemic. A human law enforcement during emergency social resistance policy, an adaptive and accessible right to education for all. And the last is enhancing participation, social solidarity, and international cooperation. Because the situation of COVID-19 pandemic in Indonesia is now very dangerous. I think we think that the international cooperation is also needed for Indonesia. Thank you very much, moderator.
Thank you very much, Pak Taufan, for providing recommendation on behalf of Komnas HAM. And I would like to also welcome Ibu Sandrayanti Moniaga, Commissioner from Komnas HAM as well, who's joining with us today. So last but not least, I would like to give the place for Ibu Andi Endriani, Chair and Commissioner of Komnas Perempuan Indonesia, to give her thoughts and recommendations on behalf of Komnas Perempuan on how we can move forward in these situations. Ibu Andi, 10 minutes, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Hanung, and also good afternoon, distinguished panelists and guests. As the last speakers, I think I second all the findings as well as the recommendations, but also allow me to inform you a more specific situation that Komnas Perempuan identified within our works during the time of pandemic. I'll share my screen. Sorry, I will take some time. Right. Though many of you have are familiar with Komnas Perempuan, allow me to begin with introducing again the National Human Rights Institution, which has a specific mandate to build conducive environment for the elimination of violence against women and the promotion of women's human rights in Indonesia. And as you all may aware of, we work within the framework of the Constitution, CEDAW, as well as the Convention of Anti-Torture and other relevant national laws and international instruments, human rights instruments. Hence, in conducting our duty to do public education, monitoring, fact findings, documentation, research, and policy recommendation, as well as cooperation within the strategic partners, we are identifying 5 priority issues during 2020-2024, namely the conflict and disasters, women in detention or detention-alike situation, women workers, on sexual violence issue, and on our own institutional strengthening. Now, giving the topic of navigating human rights in time of pandemic in ASEAN, particularly from the civil society and national human rights institutions perspective, since early 2020, when we resumed our position as commissioner, we conducted at least 5 areas of work in understanding the impact of COVID-19 as well as the policies related to it. And if I sum it up, that the first one is actually conducting strategic studies. We conducted online survey on the changing in the household during the pandemic, and we conducted a series of thematic studies on how the pandemic actually impacted women in various sectors. Utilizing the knowledge that we gathered from the strategic studies, we conduct policy dialogues, basically to endorse the adoption of more gender-sensitive policies on the pandemic, particularly related to the elimination of gender-based violence against women. We also continuously monitor the development of women human rights in general during the pandemic, as well as handling the complaint of cases of violence against women that are being submitted to Komnas Perempuan. For the past 6 months, we also conduct support for women human rights defenders in the form of fundraising, because most of the women's human rights defenders in Indonesia are not equipped with adequate health insurance. And so we utilize this fund to support, particularly when they are in self-isolation due to their health condition. And of course, we also conduct public education, presenting the result of the studies and areas of intervention that we can work together. Because we only have 10 minutes, so I would just like to highlight 6 crucial issues that we believe need to have more attention to, and some actually echoing the issues that have been raised by previous panelists. So in a nutshell, COVID-19 actually aggravates the situation of women human rights and also aggravate the existing limitations faced by women victims in accessing justice and recovery. So the first crucial issue is actually the dramatic increase of gender-based violence against women, not only in domestic violence and also violence at the working space, but also a high in online gender-based violence. Komnas Perempuan ourselves actually in 2020 received more than 68% increase of direct report and threefold in on online gender-based violence against women. We also observe that there are persisting natural resources related conflict and land disputes where women's rights is undermined, and also various violations of and also gender-based violence are committed during the conflict and the disputes itself. The second crucial issues is actually access to justice and recovery. I'm sorry, I forgot to, yeah. So we all know that numbers of institutions that providing services for women victims of violence are increasing in Indonesia since 1998. However, most of them are actually centralized in Jakarta and Java, and also in urban setting. So when the pandemic hits the country as well as globally, we see that the institutions actually reduce the duration of service hour, including the police and also the institution coordinated by the Ministry of Women's Empowerment, and also heavily rely on the information and communication technology, whilst women access to the technology might not be as such as expected. Now, the Commissioner Tohan Damnai also highlights that there are a lot of new requirement related to COVID-19 to access various assistance, including safe house, and this also a new challenge for women victims of violence in gaining more protection in facing their cases. And also online trials and meeting with lawyers are very limited in numbers, and also some areas might not be able to perform it. And we have been receiving complaints on delayed detention on cases, particularly sexual violence cases against women, and also on how the past violations of human rights are being delayed or neglected. The agenda for addressing past violations of human rights are being delayed and neglected. Another crucial issue, the third one, is actually the very limited support for women human rights defenders, particularly those attending women victims of violence. As being mentioned by Fatia earlier, we are facing the shrinking space of democracy in Indonesia, as well as in advocating for the rights itself. Hence, we still receiving reports where criminalization and intimidations against women's human rights defenders, not only those who are working on environment related to natural resources conflict, for instance, but also those who are attending women victims of violence, including domestic violence. We also receive complaints where belittling and sexual hate against women human rights defenders are occurring. In the same time, the women human rights defenders are also facing the multiple burden due to the working from home policies. They also need to perform the role as mothers and wives within the very patriarchic community, where not all the women human rights defenders have partners that are able to understand and also willing to share the burden at home. They are complaining about the additional budget that need to be provided for the COVID-19 health measures, despite their very limited resources. And there are several services that cannot be put online, so they are still facing the risk of being infected due to the service they are providing. And as I mentioned earlier, most of them do not have health insurance, hence they are severely economically impacted when their health condition are being affected by COVID-19.
Ibu Andi,
The
you
other
have 1 more
crucial issue,
minute.
the fourth one, is actually a number of women are actually at the higher risk to be infected due to the fact that women working, most of them at the frontliners sector, and also women's role in the family to attend those who are sick and elderly as well. And women also facing a higher risk to be infected when they're accessing health facility for sexual and reproductive health service, including the delayed of vaccine available in various regions in Indonesia. We have yet see affirmative action to vulnerable groups, including the people of sexual and religious minorities, though we have seen that in Jakarta, the transgender community are being supported to gain vaccine, but not in all region is available. The fifth crucial issues is on access to assistance, particularly on economic assistance. As being mentioned, the layoff is disproportionately impacted women, and many women also run micro businesses which are heavily suffer from the impact of pandemic. And in Indonesia, a large number of women are actually living in poverty in all regions and in all layers of age. And also there is a lack of support on mental health issues, despite the fact that pandemic COVID-19 also disproportionately impacted on the level of stress faced by women as being identified in our studies.
Ibu
And
Andi,
in the same time, although there are a lot of challenges that women have to face, we also identified the lack of support for women
Nice.
leadership. Though the women in the role as women human rights defenders who works optimally despite the limitations of resources they are having, or the active role they are conducting in providing assistance to the communities, as well as their individual creativity to support family economy.
Ibu Andi, if you
So
can
on that
wrap up
note on
because
crucial
the time is up.
issues, we in Komnas Perempuan believes there are at least 4 areas of cooperation that we can do together, and the SRIs, ICHR, as well as the CSOs, namely the policy advocacy. We have a comprehensive framework to address the situation of pandemic COVID-19 at the regional level, but we need to able to formulate a more precise policies and also implementation that able to address the 6 crucial issues that I mentioned earlier. And there is, of course, a need to strengthen our knowledge on how the situation is really playing or how the situation may be aggravated or can be relieved through a comparative studies or collaborative thematic studies. I would strongly request for all of us to work as support for women human rights defenders, for fundraising and protection for criminalization and other forms of supports, and also to activate all channels, social media, as well as the more conventional media that we have in our institution to raise the awareness of the gender impact and women leaderships that are necessary to move forward the agenda on women's human rights as well as human rights in general, and contributed to the elimination of all forms of violence against women that are already existing as well as being aggravated within the pandemic situation that we all are facing now. I think I stop there in order for us to have more time to discuss, though might be like 5 to 10 minutes left.
Okay.
Hope.
Thank you very much, Ibu Andi, for a very comprehensive presentation and recommendations. And this is actually really related to the comments that made by some of our participants related to the vulnerability of sex workers and jobless person who becoming homeless due to their vulnerabilities, and also challenges faced by transgender community in Indonesia who couldn't get access to the identity card that will also hamper their access to other services. And then in the chat box we have 2 questions, although we don't have much time due to the limitation of time that we have. I would like to encourage speakers, if you would like to address, you may address it in the chat box. So I would apologize for the time constraint, but I would go directly to the closing statements from each speakers. But I hope to hear perhaps one question: what actually can CSOs and the national human rights institutions can do in the national levels, and like a point of embarkment, what we can do together so that these can also fuel the discussion that we are going to have tomorrow. So for the first opportunity, Fatia, please.
Yeah, thank you very much, Hanung. First, maybe we can do a wider involvement and the organic groups involvement as well in the human rights movement through the COVID-19 situation, when the community are now really more creative, and then there are a lot of Tapur campaign that being raised by the students or youth group that is actually more effective to spread the situation and awareness related to the situation. The elements of intersectional issues such as the religious minority groups, and then minority gender groups as well, such as the LGBTIQ people, and then also that it is very important to build or creating more comprehensive and then in-depth cooperation between the state auxiliary bodies in the term of the protection for the human rights defenders, and then also the activists and human rights movements, CSOs, that actually are in the middle of the threats right now, and how we can create a very safe space for the civil society groups that can be provided by the state auxiliary bodies. Because we know that I think in the regime in the middle of the pandemic, we are facing to a more authoritarian regime, like happening in the New Order era. So it is very difficult actually when the regime is very adaptive with the technology and using new ways of the authoritarian regime right now in the middle of the millennium era. Maybe that's for the beginning on how we can create more comprehensive and fruitful cooperation and engagement between the state auxiliary bodies and then also the civil society groups.
Thank you very much, Fatia. Ryan?
Thanks, Hanung, and everyone for the presentation earlier. So I think from our side, basically, I think we need to really move forward together, I think, with the solidarity, learning from the best practices from different countries. I think that's important. Now, secondly, is also in terms of how then can we act as a pressure group, especially on this, if we can get the international like ICHA and much more to really criticize and to really comment on certain areas, that would definitely help us in our advocacy. Again, we totally acknowledge the difficulties and the challenges that these bodies have. But again, if we have the international pressure, that could also supplement the current advocacy done locally. That would also definitely help on such issues. So I think that's pretty much just a few things, just as starters, really learning from best practices and getting solidarity and much more in terms of responding to the current trends and situation in all countries. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you very much, Ryan. Gerald, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thanks for good presentations. Three things. One is we need a systematic partnership with the strength. Civil society has certain strengths on thematic functions and areas, and so need a long-term ongoing working together. Working together is also means to utilize the powers of the human rights institution, because human rights institutions are statutory bodies by law, act of parliament or constitution. And there are many things that the Commission can do and must do that civil society cannot do. And that's where the partnership is important, to go where you cannot move, to go where you cannot see the victims. And that's where I think our role and function happen. The third part, I think civil society must continue to defend human rights institution and strengthen human rights institution. Because without civil society voice and strength, governments actually will find ways to belittle our work and function. So I think that's the three things I'll end up with. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerald. Pak Taufan, the floor.
Thank you. Firstly, of course, we will continue our mandate to monitor the implementation of the policies on handling COVID-19 in Indonesia. But for that, our effort is to ensure, to make sure that the policy, all policies, regarding to handling pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic in Indonesia should refer to the standard and norm of human rights. That's the main idea that Komnas HAM would like to introduce to the government in central or in regional. And then we are now drafting the standard and norm on right to health. There's a kind of general comment regarding if we talk about human rights work on human rights in international. In Indonesia, Komnas HAM introduced or published standard and norm. And now we are drafting, almost finalizing the standard and norm of right to health. We would like to endorse, to urge the government to use this kind of standard and norm in implementing, in designing the policy. And the last, of course, we need cooperation. Not only NHRI, but also with the NGOs, civil societies, ICHA, and also the intellectual. Because we need, of course, expert academicians also to mitigate the situation of the pandemic COVID-19 pandemic. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pak Taufan and Ibu Andi. The floor is yours.
Hi, thank you. I second all the recommendation made by the previous panelists, and I will reinstate the 4 recommendations that I mentioned earlier, which namely that we need to push forward the policies and implementation of those policies that enabling the most vulnerable groups to be able to access their human rights. And secondly, to better gather the knowledge within the region as well as in our localities and at national flora. The third one is actually to support the human rights defenders, in particular women's human rights defenders. And on that note, allow me to also stress the importance for us all to develop a better strategy in handling the mental health situation. Many of us working in a very challenging time, not only due to the behavior and also the policies of the state, but also the health situation within our own organization and our own families. And many of us may suffer from severe or burnt out. So I really would like to highlight the need for us all to also think of strategies as an area of collaboration between NDSRI, CSOs, as well as ICHR to look at the issues of mental health situation. And lastly is actually to gather more public support. In the time of pandemic, we know that there is a lot of hoax as well as hate speech around. And in Indonesia, at least, I can tell that many people believe or many people think that human rights defenders are in their own planet, working on the issues that are not directly connected to their daily needs, namely like the instant assistance to support them having the relief from the pandemic. So we also need to be able to develop better strategy to gain public support for areas of issues which are not directly linked to the pandemic, but may actually undermine during the situation of the pandemic, and we are not able to if we are not able to communicate it to the public, it may actually reduce our effectiveness in works. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for all presenters for very comprehensive recommendations. Please join me to give a round of applause to them, and that will be the end of the session 2. And to wrap up our sessions and activity today, we are humbled to have Professor Fitit Muntaborn, who's going to give the closing remarks for today. Professor Fitit is a Professor Emeritus at the Faculty of Law, Chulalongkorn University, Bangkok, and he has helped the UN in a variety of positions, including as UN independent experts on protection against violence and discriminations based on sexual orientation and gender identity, the UNSR for North Korea, and also currently as the UN Special Rapporteur for Cambodia, and many other roles. Professor Fitit, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Hello, everyone. Warm greetings from Bangkok. Thank you very much for the invitation to join this important meeting. And I'd like to express my sympathy to the victims of COVID-19. And I express also great empathy to all ASEAN countries and all the peoples of the region in this struggle against the pandemic. I have 4 scenarios that I would like to leave with you to link up with tomorrow after today. Number 1, COVID caveat. Caveat means be careful. COVID caveat. Number 2, emergency and intricacy. Emergency and intricacy. Number 3, ASEAN milestone 2021 plus. And number 4, our stepping stones, 2021 plus. COVID caveats. First of all, be very careful about the accumulation of executive power. This is what COVID has brought to our region and beyond. And I'll talk about state of emergency in a moment. Some governments don't wish to leave, actually, as we've heard. They want to stay, precisely to save themselves. Number 2, securitization. Securitization. The invocation of national security, public order, public health, overuse of security, which affects the whole range of human rights, and which also leads to too much claim of national security, fake threats, not fake speech. It's fake threats through advocacy, too much advocacy of national security, aggravated by hate speech that follows and so on. And number 3, under COVID caveat, the full range of human rights have been affected. Even though initially we think about health, but as you've heard today, it's everything. It's poverty, work, unemployment, education, and very importantly, not just economic, social, cultural rights, but civil political rights, expression, association, assembly, and the role of human rights defenders as a whole, together with everybody else. So that's the context. That's the context where we are working to give hope. And the point is, we're not going to give up hope. We're here to give hope. So let's look at the emergency and the intricacy as to what we can do a bit more. Well, 108 countries at last count globally have adopted some sort of state of emergency today, including most ASEAN countries. And when they do this, it is very important for us to advocate rules to clamp down also on this state of emergency to ensure that they're not excessive. In other words, we need some rules, and we do have rules on this. 7 of the Southeast Asian countries, including Timor, and 6 ASEAN countries, are parties to the Covenant on Civil Political Rights, which have standards on state of emergency as constraints on state of emergency. And we need to use this reasoning. State of emergency should only be invoked where there is the survival of the state at stake. There are non-derogable rights which cannot be limited, such as freedom from torture, right to life. There are derogable rights, such as freedom of expression and so on, but there must be justification, there must be some reason for limiting these derogable rights, and we have standards for them, including non-arbitrary limitations. There must be some legality, some law, valid law behind the constraint. The rule of necessity, the government has to prove it's necessary. The rule of proportionality, it must be proportionate to the circumstances. The limitations must be proportionate to the circumstances. There must be legitimate grounds for protection, to protect the rights of others, for example. And there must be some basis of non-discrimination as well as universal standards at play. So these are there to be used, and I think they can also be invoked in countries which are not parties to the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Secondly, on emergency and intricacy, maybe government doesn't have to use the state of emergency at all, because many rights are already not absolute. They can be limited within reason. Freedom of expression can be limited within reason, but again, the government has to prove that it's necessary, it's proportionate, it's legitimate to limit the rights concerned. So maybe we should be looking to see and advocate that circumstances do not dictate the need for a state of emergency at all. while the government already has some discretion, reasoned discretion, to limit rights. And thirdly, finally, on emergency and intricacy, be very careful with use of ordinances and decrees which seem to override parliamentary acts and parliamentary rule in many countries today, sadly. Over here in this country, we use a state of emergency decree, which is not a parliamentary act, it's an executive order. And even last week, there was a battle in the courts in terms of debate in the court concerning the non-validity of an order issued under the emergency decree. The order was something like this over here. The order said that the spreading of information which causes fear among the population, impliedly even real, truthful information, if it causes fear among the population, can be prohibited. That was what the order said. And the court said here last week that that is not constitutional. So now that order has been blocked because it's an excessive order using an emergency decree and order coming from the executive without reason. And that's over here, but you can check in your other countries that the same is happening on many fronts in terms of unreasonable orders, ordinances coming through. Thirdly, the ASEAN milestone. The ASEAN milestone. Well, now we have lots of plans, we have lots of policies coming from ASEAN, and the main one on COVID is, as you've heard, the ASEAN 5-point comprehensive recovery framework, which is constituted of enhancing health system, strengthen human security, maximize trade, accelerate inclusive digital information, and then advancing sustainability and resilient future. Well, if that is the policy of ASEAN today as the milestone for 21 plus, I think what's been very useful with this conference is to advocate that all those 5 components must be tested through the lens of human rights-based approach, bearing in mind the total picture of civil, political, economic, social, cultural rights. Not just health, but also expression. Not just education, but also non-discrimination generally. Non-violence in terms of vulnerabilities affecting many groups, including migrant workers and others. And very importantly, women, children, the elderly, disabilities, and so on. So let's invite the ASEAN Recovery Framework to look at the lens, to abide by the lens of human rights. And let's monitor that framework accordingly from our side. And finally, what about the future? Our stepping stones, 2021 plus. I have 5 messages. I'll go through them very quickly. Number 1, let's strengthen vigilance. Keep awake. 2, let's safeguard checks and balances. 3, let's open up to grievances to find remedies. 4, let's maximize convergences in terms of partnerships and cooperation. And 5, let's leverage for compliance of human rights standards. And let's take some examples for those 5. Number 1, strengthen vigilance. Keep our eyes open. A medical lockdown should not mean a political clampdown. Many countries are seeing the political clampdown through the advocacy, according to the government, of a medical lockdown, ironically. And we have to expose this by being vigilant. And we've heard many other issues being raised today in terms of how we need to open up to the intricacies of states of emergency and all the anomalies, the absurdities that come through too much power being accumulated by the executive branch. Secondly, let's safeguard checks and balances. Let's work to try to retain the space of civil society, work together with national rights institutions and other actors, internationally, regionally, and locally, open up the space as best we can, and we're not going to give up. We will do our best to retain and safeguard the checks and balances. And I hope that ICHA, ACWC, and others will help us. And you have the UN system too, as part of the checks and balances. Please link up with special procedures, rapporteurs, rights committee, and others. Use the totality of checks and balances and strengthen the cooperation. Thirdly, open up to grievances, meaning transparency. And we've heard many grievances here. And I think one very important message for ICHA, ACWC, or the ASEAN institutions is that we support you very much to have more channels to receive complaints, to act on grievances, and to provide justice, access to justice. And I know, as you may know, that ICHA is trying to find a way today through its own interpretation of its terms of reference, through its work plan, and maybe also we'll have a review panel that can be supportive of more channels to receive grievances and to act on them to provide remedies and redress, including against discrimination, including against violence. And fourthly, fourth, second to final, let's maximize convergences. The wisdom that we've heard today, and surely tomorrow, is multifaceted, multidimensional cooperation and partnerships. Different groups, let's work together, NGOs, CSOs, NIs, national institutions, ICHA, and beyond. Let's find different channels. And one very encouraging sign of the times, which we heard today, was now the ICHA and hopefully ACWC, the ASEAN institutions, will work more with the national human rights institutions. Southeast Asian National Human Rights Institutions Forum, which consists also of Timor, and that's beyond ASEAN, and that's good. And they're going to have a meeting, hopefully, on the issue of COVID and human rights very soon, and I hope that will lead to good advocacy in terms of cooperation, a convergence to address the issues that we're talking about. And finally, let's leverage for compliance with human rights. And the strategy for promoting compliance can also be manifold. We work on prevention, good education, for example, which we are advocating, good information dissemination, good awareness raising, good vigilance, good laws. Don't apply bad laws. That is prevention. Don't apply bad laws or bad policies, and yes, reform them as prevention. But pending that, don't apply bad laws. There are too many of them around here. Secondly, protection as part of the leverage for compliance, protection of rights, addressing vulnerabilities, different groups we've heard today, nationals, non-nationals, migrants, refugees, children, etc. And very importantly, sadly with COVID, violence, which is coming through at home, domestic violence, as well as the alienation felt by children who are out of school, sadly. And even online is an issue because a lot of people are not online, so there is disparity there, sadly. So let's work on protection by good outreach, good access, with due respect to rights for all. Thirdly, on the compliance, remedies and remediation, meaning different types of remedies and redress, and many of us, different capacities, including the national rights institutions, the courts, can offer remedies, both informal and formal. And please don't forget, ICHA and beyond, we're looking to you also to provide us with some remedies, together with the UN system as a whole, as part of the friendship that we're trying to build. And last but not least, of course, the variety of cooperation as part of the compliance. Good government, some good government officials, surely, yes. NGOs and beyond, local, national, regional, international. Don't forget the gap between rural and urban people, particularly marginalized groups in the rural areas. Don't forget the gap between those who have and don't have. Poverty is increasing, unemployment, uneducated, sadly also, and the big divide in terms of the online divide, the digital divide, which has gender-related implications. We know that often women might have less access to the online, and we need to capacity build in that regard. So solidarity is very important. A sense of humanity is very important. And last and not least, of course, with all this, we're here to connect. Connectivity, not just technical online connectivity, mindsets, a sense of care, a sense of empathy. And that's where we can all come in. What counts also is just not just the policy or the law, but the heart. Not just the brain, but also the helping hand. So let's build on that as part of a connectivity that is geared to humanity as a whole, and in this region, while not forgetting all the other regions of the world. Luck, and see you tomorrow. Thank you very much for all the wisdom. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Tabor, for very powerful remarks and for his willingness as well to link all of the recommendations that have made by the speakers today. So this is the end of day one, and as Gerald has mentioned previously, that our purpose is to find ways of partnership and collaboration between CSOs, NHRIs, and also ACWC and ICHR to address the human rights crisis that happened due to the COVID-19 situations. So this is something that we are going to tackle also tomorrow. Just to remind the agenda that tomorrow will be CSO discussion at 1 p.m. For the civil society to craft further the recommendations that have been made by speakers today, and to make it more concretized on what we can do together, and then also followed by presentations and further discussion at 2:30 p.m. in which we kindly request the presence of distinguished ICHR and ACWC representative here, as well as representatives from the NHRIs also to join and discuss further, share their thoughts, and together to strengthen the action plan that we can do together. And before I close, there's some requests for presentation files. Our organizer will seek for consent first from the speakers before sharing the presentation file to a wider audience. Once we get their consents, and we will distribute it for you. So our utmost appreciations to our speakers today who have joined us, and also for all participants who have joined us until now. And it's 4 p.m. We are right on time, and hope to see you tomorrow or in another occasion, either virtually or offline after COVID-19. Thank you very much, and have a good day.